The little girl stood frozen at the checkout counter, her worn sneakers barely touching the scuffed linoleum floor. Her blonde hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and her oversized jacket, 3 sizes too big, swallowed her small frame. In her trembling hands, she clutched a single loaf of bread against her chest, like it was made of gold. Her bottom lip quivered as she stared at the cashier's screen, watching the numbers she couldn't fully understand, but knew meant trouble. Behind her, the line was growing. A woman with a shopping cart full of groceries checked her phone impatiently. A businessman in a crisp suit shifted his weight from foot to foot. And directly behind the little girl stood 3 massive figures that made other customers instinctively step back. Bikers, dressed in black leather and denim, their vests adorned with patches and club insignia, their boots heavy on the floor. The cashier, an older woman named Ruth, who had worked this register for 20 years, watched the little girl count out coins with shaking fingers. Pennies, nickels, a few dimes. The girl's voice, barely above a whisper, cracked as she spoke the words that would change everything. "My mom can't afford bread." The store seemed to hold its breath. Ruth's hand paused over the register. The impatient customers suddenly found something fascinating to look at on their phones. And the 3 bikers, men who looked like they could tear apart a car with their bare hands, exchanged a glance that carried an entire conversation. The little girl's name was Emma Hartley, and she was 7 years old. She lived with her mother, Sarah, in a rundown motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where rooms rented by the week and dreams went to die slowly. Room 14 had become their entire world. A double bed they shared, a microwave that only worked sometimes, a mini fridge that hummed too loudly, and a bathroom with tiles that had given up trying to stay white. Sarah Hartley had once been a dental hygienist with a steady paycheck, a small house, and plans for Emma's future. But life has a way of dismantling security with cruel efficiency. First came the divorce from Emma's father, who disappeared with another woman and left them with nothing but debt. Then Sarah's mother, Emma's grandmother, fell ill. Sarah quit her job to provide round-the-clock care, burning through their savings in months. When her mother finally passed, Sarah found herself jobless, broke, and unable to keep up with rent. The eviction notice came on Emma's 6th birthday. They'd been living in the motel for 8 months now. Sarah worked 2 jobs, early mornings cleaning office buildings and late nights stocking shelves at a warehouse. But the wages barely covered the weekly motel fee. Food became a luxury they carefully calculated. Emma had learned not to ask for things. She'd learned that her mother's tired eyes meant another bill had arrived, that the sound of her mother crying softly in the bathroom meant they might not have electricity for the microwave that week. But Emma never complained. She was wise beyond her years in the way that children forced to grow up too quickly often are. She noticed everything. Her mother skipping meals while insisting Emma eat, the way her mother's jeans hung looser each week, the darkness under her eyes that no amount of sleep could fix. On this particular Tuesday morning, Sarah had given Emma her last $5 and sent her to the grocery store 3 blocks away. "Just bread, baby," she'd said, her voice tight with exhaustion. "Just the cheapest loaf you can find." Emma had nodded solemnly, tucking the $5 bill into her jacket pocket like it was a treasure map. Inside the grocery store, Emma had gone straight to the bread aisle. She'd scanned the prices carefully, her finger tracing under the numbers as she counted in her head. The cheapest loaf was $3.49. That should leave enough for something else, maybe eggs. But at the register, when Ruth scanned the bread, the total came to $3.72 with tax. Emma's heart sank. She pulled out the $5 bill, her face falling as she did the math. That left only $1.28. Not enough for eggs? Barely enough for anything. "That'll be $3.72, sweetheart," Ruth said gently. Emma's fingers trembled as she counted out exact change. But then she looked at the nearly empty basket area, thinking of her mother's gaunt face, and the words tumbled out before she could stop them. "My mom can't afford bread." It wasn't quite true. They could afford this loaf, barely. But the larger truth behind those words hung in the air like smoke. They couldn't afford bread and anything else. They couldn't afford to live like this. Ruth's eyes misted immediately. She'd seen struggling families before, but something about this tiny girl with her too big jacket and her careful counting broke through the professional barrier Ruth usually maintained. The three bikers behind Emma had been silent up until that moment. They'd noticed the little girl when they'd walked in, mostly because she looked so small and determined. They'd ended up in line behind her by chance, returning from a charity poker run for the local children's hospital. Their leather vests bore the unmistakable patches of the Hells Angels, a motorcycle club with a reputation that preceded them. Rough, intimidating, the kind of men people whispered about and avoided. The largest of the three was a man called Bear, a nickname he'd earned decades ago that fit him like his own skin. He stood 6'5", weighed close to 300 pounds of muscle and attitude, and had a beard that would make Vikings jealous. His arms were covered in tattoos that told the story of a hard life. Military service, lost brothers, battles fought on streets and inside himself. Around his neck hung a small silver cross, barely visible against his black shirt. Beside Bear stood Ghost, a wiry man with silver, hair pulled back in a ponytail, his face weathered by years of sun and wind. And the third was Hammer, younger than the other two but no less imposing, with scarred knuckles and eyes that had seen things he wished he could forget. When Emma whispered those 5 words, Bear felt something inside his chest crack open. He'd been that kid once. Different circumstances, different era, but the same bone-deep poverty that made a loaf of bread feel like an impossible luxury. He remembered his own mother crying over an empty pantry, remembered the shame of free lunch tickets at school, remembered the gnawing hunger that became so constant you almost stopped noticing it. If you believe in the power of observation, in trusting your instincts, and in the courage it takes to speak up when something feels wrong, then pause for a moment. Like, comment, share, and subscribe to Bike Diaries. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, because this story will remind you that heroes come in all sizes, and sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important messages. Bear glanced at Ghost, who gave the slightest nod. Hammer's jaw was already set in determination. Bear stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over Emma, who looked up with wide, frightened eyes. But Bear's voice, when it came, was surprisingly gentle. "How much she need?" he asked Ruth, not Emma, as if understanding that the little girl had already been through enough. Ruth glanced at Emma, then at Bear. "The bread is $3.72. She's got it covered, but that ain't what I asked." Bear's voice was firm, but not harsh. "How much to fill a cart for her family? Real food? The kind a kid should be eating?" Ruth blinked, caught off guard. I don't know. Maybe $150? $200 for a good supply?" Bear pulled out his wallet, worn leather held together more by habit than integrity, and placed $200 bills on the counter. "Ring up whatever she needs. If there's extra, she can come back for more later." He looked down at Emma, whose eyes had gone impossibly wide. "You got a mama waiting for you at home?" Emma nodded, too shocked to speak. "She working herself to death trying to keep you fed?" Another nod, this one accompanied by tears that finally spilled over. Bear's expression softened in a way that transformed his entire face. "Then let's make sure she don't have to worry about it for a while. You go pick out some real food, kid. Eggs, milk, meat, vegetables, whatever you need. We'll wait right here. Ghost stepped forward and handed Emma a shopping basket. Go on, little one. Get the good stuff. Emma looked at Ruth, who was openly crying now, then back at the three massive bikers who somehow didn't seem scary anymore. Really? Really, Hammer confirmed. But hurry up. We got places to be. Emma moved through the aisles like someone in a dream, carefully selecting items she and her mother hadn't been able to afford in months. Fresh apples. A carton of eggs, real butter, chicken breast, a gallon of milk, cheese, pasta, sauce. She was crying the entire time, barely able to see through her tears, but she kept going, filling the basket until her arms ached. When she returned to the register, Ruth helped her unload everything. The total came to $187.34. Bear nodded with satisfaction. But before Emma could leave, Bear crouched down to her level. What's your mama's name, kid? Sarah, Emma whispered. Sarah Hartley. And where you living? The motel. The one with the blue sign. Room 14. Bear straightened up, his expression unreadable. He exchanged another look with Ghost and Hammer, and something passed between them that needed no words. You get that food home safe, Bear told Emma, and you tell your mama that she's doing a damn good job raising you. Sometimes good people hit hard times. Ain't no shame in that. Emma nodded, clutching the bags that Ruth had carefully packed for her. Thank you, she managed, her voice breaking. Thank you so much. No thanks needed, little one. Just pay it forward someday when you can. Emma walked out of that grocery store, carrying bags that felt like they held more than food. They held hope, proof that kindness existed, evidence that the world hadn't completely given up on her and her mother. The three bikers watched her go, then turned to Ruth. You got a manager here? What happened next would become local legend. Bear, Ghost, and Hammer walked into the manager's office. The manager, a middle-aged man named Dale, looked up with alarm as three members of the Hells Angels filled his doorway. We need to talk about the families in this neighborhood, Bear said without preamble. The ones who can't afford groceries. You know who they are? Dale swallowed hard. Some of them, yeah. We see regulars who count pennies. Kids who come in trying to make food stamps stretch. Why? Because we're gonna do something about it, Ghost said. Tonight. What they proposed was audacious. The bikers wanted to buy out a significant portion of the store's inventory. Food, toiletries, cleaning supplies, basics that struggling families needed, and distribute it to the neighborhood's most vulnerable residents. How much we talking? Dale asked. How much you got? Bear replied. By noon, word had spread through the Hells Angels chapter. By 2 o'clock, more than 20 bikers had arrived at the grocery store, their motorcycles lining the parking lot like a gathering storm. By 4 o'clock, they'd raised over $15,000. They moved through that store like a force of nature, filling cart after cart with essentials. Other shoppers stopped and stared, amazed. The bikers weren't taking anything. They were buying everything. Entire shelves of canned goods disappeared into their carts. Fresh produce, meats, bread, pasta, rice, beans, baby formula, diapers, soap, shampoo. If a family needed it, it went into a cart. Dale had never seen anything like it. His staff scrambled to keep up with the transactions. By 7 o'clock that evening, as the sun began to set, 20 motorcycles left the grocery store parking lot loaded down with bags and boxes. They rode in formation through the neighborhood, engines rumbling like thunder. They stopped first at the motel with the blue sign. Sarah Hartley had been pacing room 14 for hours, worry eating through her already frayed nerves. Emma should have been back long ago. The thoughts spiraled darker until she heard the knock on the door. She yanked it open and froze. Emma stood there, barely visible behind the mountain of grocery bags she'd somehow carried. Behind her, 3 impossibly large men in leather vests waited on the motel walkway, their expressions gentle despite their intimidating appearance. "Mama," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion, "these men helped us." Sarah's hands flew to her mouth. She looked from her daughter to the bikers to the bags of groceries, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Bear stepped forward. "Ma'am, your daughter told us you were having a hard time. We've all been there. This ain't charity. This is community." Sarah started to cry, great heaving sobs that she'd been holding back for months. Emma set down the bags and wrapped her arms around her mother's waist, both of them crying together in the doorway. But the bikers weren't done. Over the next hour, they distributed food to every family in that motel who needed it. And there were many. Single mothers like Sarah, elderly people on fixed incomes, veterans struggling with injuries and trauma. The bikers knocked on doors, asked simple questions, listened to stories, and left boxes of supplies without judgment or expectation. They did the same at the apartment complex down the street. By midnight, they'd reached more than 40 families, leaving behind not just food, but something more valuable. The knowledge that they weren't alone, that someone cared. In room 14, Sarah and Emma sat on their bed surrounded by groceries, still crying, still unable to fully comprehend what had happened. Among the bags was a simple note written in rough handwriting. "For Sarah and Emma. Hard times don't last forever. Keep fighting. You're not alone." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. If this story has touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Bike Diaries. We bring you stories that prove heroism comes in all forms, that courage isn't measured by size or age, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important messages. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever noticed something important that others missed? Your story might inspire someone else. The impact of that night rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. The grocery store manager, Dale, established a discretionary fund for families in need. Ruth, the cashier, started a food drive at her church. Other businesses in the neighborhood began looking for ways to support struggling residents. Sarah found new strength in knowing that people cared. Within 2 weeks, she'd found a better-paying job with regular hours. Within a month, she and Emma had moved into a small apartment. Nothing fancy, but it had a real kitchen and a bedroom for Emma, and windows that let in actual sunlight. But more than the material improvements, something fundamental had shifted inside both of them. They'd learned that pride sometimes needs to be swallowed, that asking for help isn't weakness, that the world contains more good than the news would have you believe. Emma grew up carrying that lesson. She volunteered at food banks throughout high school. She studied social work in college. She became the kind of person who noticed when others were struggling, who spoke up when someone needed help, who believed in the power of small acts to create large changes. And the Hells Angels? They never publicized what they'd done. No social media posts, no press releases, no expectation of recognition. They did it because they remembered being hungry, being scared, being on the edge of giving up. They did it because they knew that sometimes the people who look the scariest have the biggest hearts. Years later, when Emma was 25 and working as a social worker herself, she'd tell the story of that day in the grocery store to the families she helped. She'd explain how 5 words, "My mom can't afford bread," had changed everything. How vulnerability had opened the door to grace. How the world's toughest-looking angels sometimes wore leather instead of wings. And she'd always end the story the same way. Never be ashamed of needing help. And never underestimate the power of speaking up. You never know who's listening. Sometimes salvation arrives on motorcycles. Thank you for watching. If this story reminded you to trust your instincts, to speak up when something feels wrong, and to never underestimate the power of paying attention. Please share it. Subscribe to Bike Diaries for more stories that prove heroes are everywhere. Courage comes in all forms, and sometimes the smallest person in the room has the biggest impact. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done in Emma's place? Bear, Ghost, and Hammer rode away from that neighborhood that night with lighter wallets and fuller hearts, the rumble of their engines fading into the darkness, leaving behind a community forever changed by the reminder that humanity, at its core, is still capable of profound goodness, that sometimes the most hardened exteriors protect the softest hearts, that angels come in unexpected forms, and that 5 words whispered by a 7-year-old girl can start a revolution of kindness that echoes through generations. Because in the end, it's never really about the bread. It's about remembering we're all human. It's about seeing each other, truly seeing each other, and choosing to care. And it's about knowing that even in our darkest moments, when we feel most alone, somewhere out there is a stranger who might just become our salvation if we're brave enough to ask for help. Emma never forgot that lesson, and neither should we.